I've been paying for my parents' living expenses, but at a Christmas party, I found out they were mocking me as a low-educated freelancer. So, I cut them off and stopped sending them money. So, I've been thinking about this a lot lately because it's Christmas again, and it's bringing up a lot of memories from last year. Honestly, I've been trying not to dwell on it too much, but it's hard when the decorations, music, and general holiday vibes remind me of how everything went down. Last Christmas was when I realized how messed up things were with my family and decided to finally put myself first. For a little background, my name's Lucas, and I'm 28 now. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, which sounds cozy until you're the one everyone whispers about. My family was what you'd call average on the outside. Mom, Dad, me, and my little sister, Emily. My grandparents lived with us too for a while, and they were probably the only ones who really cared about me, but I'll get to that. Emily is 7 years younger than me, and from the moment she was born, she was basically the queen of the house. I don't blame her for that. She didn't ask to be the favorite, but it was obvious to everyone. Even as a kid, her birthdays were these huge events with decorations, cakes, and gifts that would make you think she was royalty. Meanwhile, my birthdays were combined with Christmas. My birthday is a few days before, with one gift, usually something useful like a notebook or socks. I mean, I get it, times were tough, but it still felt like I didn't matter as much. It wasn't just birthdays, though. When Emily joined the debate team in high school, my parents were at every competition cheering her on. But when I played my last basketball game as a senior, they didn't even show up. They said they had to take Emily to practice. Stuff like that happened all the time. It wasn't even subtle. Now, my grandparents? They were great. My grandma especially would always try to make me feel included. She'd tell my parents off for ignoring me, but honestly, it didn't change much. When they passed away, both within a few months of each other, it was like the last bit of support I had in that house disappeared. My parents started leaning on me more, but not in the way you'd expect. By the time I graduated high school, I already knew college wasn't in the cards for me. I wanted to study computer science. I was obsessed with coding, building little programs on my own whenever I could. But my parents shut that down immediately. We don't have the money for that, they said, as if that was the end of the conversation. But somehow, they had money for Emily's extracurriculars and private tutors. It hurt, but what could I do? So, I moved to the city and got a job at a small tech company doing clerical work. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I was determined to make something of myself. I taught myself to code in my free time, YouTube tutorials, free courses, anything I could get my hands on. After a year or so, I managed to move into an entry-level developer role at the same company. Even though I was finally on my own, my parents were still a big presence in my life. They started calling me every month, asking for money. It wasn't framed as a request either. It was more like an expectation. You know, raising kids isn't cheap, my mom would say. Or, we've done so much for you. It's the least you can do. And yeah, I started sending them money every month, even though I didn't have much to spare. It didn't stop there. When Emily got accepted into a prestigious law school, I genuinely felt happy for her. Even though things had always been unbalanced between us growing up, I still cared about her. She was my little sister, and I wanted her to do well. My parents called me the day she got her acceptance letter, going on and on about how proud they were. She's going to be a lawyer, my mom kept saying like she'd already passed the bar. Of course, the conversation didn't end there. They brought up how expensive law school was and how much Emily would need to succeed. Then came the subtle hints about how I could help. You know, it would mean so much to her if you could pitch in, my dad said. My mom chimed in. You're doing so well now. It's only fair to help your sister. After all, we've supported you your whole life. I didn't even argue. Maybe it was the guilt they'd instilled in me over the years. Or maybe I just wanted to believe I was doing the right thing. Emily was always kind to me when we were younger, standing up for me when our parents compared us. I wanted to support her like she had supported me back then. That's why I agreed to help. I ended up covering her first year tuition, the admission fees, and even some of the living expenses so she could move closer to campus. It wasn't easy. I had to dip into my savings, and for months I lived on a tighter budget just to make it work. At first it felt worth it. Emily was so grateful, or at least that's how it seemed. She called me a lot in those first few months, thanking me over and over for helping her out. I wouldn't be able to do this without you, Lucas, she said once. I remember feeling a weird mix of pride and relief hearing those words. It was like all the sacrifices I'd made were finally paying off. She'd tell me about her classes and how challenging but exciting they were. We've got this one professor who's like a total legend in the field, she'd say. He's tough, but I'm learning so much. I like hearing about her life, even if I couldn't relate to it. I hadn't gone to college, so I didn't have stories about professors or campus life. But through her, I got a small glimpse of what it was like, and that felt nice. The call started to slow down after a while. At first, I didn't think much of it. Law school sounded intense, and I figured she was just busy. When she did call, it was usually because she needed something. Hey, Lucas, I'm running low on rent money. Can you help? Or, I need this textbook, but it's crazy expensive. Can you send me a bit to cover it? I always said yes. I told myself it was just temporary. That once she graduated and became a lawyer, everything would even out. She'd pay me back, and maybe our parents would finally start treating me with some respect too. But then her tone started changing. The gratitude from earlier in the year was gone, replaced with this expectation, like it was my duty to help her. There was no thank you anymore, just a quick acknowledgement before she hung up. When I tried to ask her how she was doing or talk about my life, she seemed distracted, like she couldn't wait to get off the phone. Yeah, I'm fine, Lucas. Anyway, about that rent money, I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding petty, so I let it slide. But it started to eat at me. I'd be sitting at my desk at work, thinking about how much I was sacrificing for her while she barely acknowledged it. I was skipping out on things I wanted, new clothes, dinners out with friends, even saving for a better apartment, just so she could focus on school without worrying about money. The thing that really got to me was how our parents acted during all of this. Every time they called, it was the same story. Emily's doing so well. We're so proud of her. They'd gush. If they mentioned me at all, it was only in relation to how I was helping Emily. It's good that you're supporting her, Lucas. That's what family does. Not once did they ask how I was doing. They didn't know about the long hours I was putting in at work or the freelance projects I was taking on just to make ends meet. They didn't know how drained I felt, working nonstop while watching my savings dwindle away. And honestly, I didn't expect them to ask. That's just how it had always been. By the end of Emily's first year, things between us had shifted completely. She didn't call unless she needed something, and when I reached out, she barely responded. I remember one time I texted her asking how her exams went. She replied a day later with a single word, good, no follow-up, no details. It felt like I was talking to a stranger. I started to resent her, but I didn't know how to deal with it. I told myself she was just stressed, that it wasn't personal. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being taken for granted. Not just by Emily, but by my parents too. One night I got a call from my mom. She wanted to talk about Emily, of course. She's doing so well, Lucas. You should be proud of her. She said the same way she always did. I muttered something about how I was glad she was doing well, but I guess my tone gave me away. What's wrong? My mom asked, sounding more annoyed than concerned. Nothing, I said quickly. But then I couldn't stop myself. It's just, I feel like all I ever do is give. I've been helping Emily nonstop, and it's like no one even notices. There was a long pause before she responded. Lucas, don't be selfish. Emily is doing something important with her life. You're just working in tech. She's going to be a lawyer. You should be happy to support her. That hit me hard. It was like all the work I'd put into building my life didn't matter because I didn't have a fancy title or a degree. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. So I just said, okay, and hung up. That conversation stuck with me for weeks. I started to see everything more clearly. By that time, I was exhausted physically, emotionally, and financially, but I didn't know what to do. Cutting them off felt impossible. They were my family after all, but part of me wondered how much longer I could keep this up before I broke completely. Last Christmas, I got a call from my mom a few weeks before the holiday. She sounded unusually chipper, which immediately put me on edge. Usually, when she was in a good mood, it meant she was about to ask for something. But instead of the usual spiel about money, she invited me to a Christmas party at their place. We're having everyone over this year, relatives, neighbors, even a few of Emily's friends, she said. It'll be nice to have the whole family together again. You'll come, won't you? I wasn't sure at first. Going home always came with its share of baggage, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with all that. But she kept pressing. It's been ages since we all got together, she said, guilt dripping from her voice. Emily would love to see you. And it's Christmas. Don't you want to spend the holiday with your family? I agreed, mostly to avoid the endless calls and guilt trips I knew would follow if I said no. Plus, I figured it might be a chance to reconnect with everyone. Maybe things wouldn't be so bad this time. So I took the train back to town on Christmas Eve, carrying a few small gifts I'd picked up for everyone. Nothing fancy, just little things I thought they'd appreciate. When I got to the house, it was packed. There were relatives I hadn't seen in years, neighbors I barely recognized, and even a few of Emily's old high school friends. The energy in the house was loud and chaotic, but in that festive way that made it feel like Christmas. At first, it was actually kind of nice. I caught up with a couple of cousins, made small talk with some neighbors, and even managed to chat with Emily for a bit. She seemed busy, though, flitting from group to group like she was hosting the whole thing. The evening started to shift when my dad called everyone into the living room. He stood up by the fireplace, holding a glass and grinning like he was about to announce something big. My mom stood beside him, beaming, and Emily was next to her, looking a little smug. Thank you all for coming, my dad began. It's so wonderful to have everyone here to celebrate the holidays. But tonight isn't just about Christmas. It's also about celebrating some incredible news. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew where this was going. We're here to celebrate Emily, who's just finished her first year at law school with flying colors, he said. Everyone clapped, and a few people even cheered. My mom jumped in, talking about how proud they were of her, how hard she was working, and how bright her future looked. I clapped along with everyone else, but I couldn't help feeling a little invisible. It wasn't that I wanted a big announcement or anything, but it stung that my parents didn't even mention me, not a word about how I'd helped pay for Emily's first year, or how I'd been sending money home for years. As the night went on, it got worse. Emily started talking about her law school experiences, and at first it was kind of interesting, but then she started bragging. Law school is no joke, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. It's not like working a regular 9 to 5 job. It takes real intelligence and dedication. You can't just wing it. I tried to brush it off, but then she made a comment that hit a little too close to home. I mean, coding? That's something anyone can learn online these days. It's not exactly rocket science. I glanced around the room, expecting someone to say something. But instead, my parents laughed. My dad even nodded like he agreed. I felt a mix of anger and embarrassment. Here I was working my ass off to support myself and them, and they were mocking my career like it didn't matter. At one point, a neighbor I'd known since I was a kid came up to me. "Lucas, you're doing great, right? I heard you're working in tech," she said with a warm smile. Before I could even respond, my mom jumped in. "Oh, he's doing okay," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "But Emily is the real star of the family. She's going to be a lawyer, you know?" My dad chuckled. "Lucas is good at what he does, but it's not exactly prestigious." I excused myself and went into the kitchen, pretending to check on the food. I just needed a minute to breathe. I overheard more of their conversation from the kitchen. My mom was telling some relatives about how they had to step in to help Emily because I wasn't pulling my weight. It was like a whole flip of the truth. I'd paid for her tuition. I'd sent the money every month. And yet, they still found a way to paint me as the failure. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my coat and left. They barely even noticed. Emily was too busy basking in the attention, and my parents were too busy talking about how amazing she was. After that Christmas party, something inside me just switched off. It wasn't like one of those dramatic, life-changing realizations you see in movies. It was more like a slow, sinking realization that I couldn't keep living like this. For years, I'd been bending over backward for my family, constantly trying to be good enough. And for what? To be laughed at behind my back? To be treated like an afterthought? The day after Christmas, my phone started buzzing nonstop. First it was my mom, then my dad, and eventually Emily chimed in too. They all wanted to know why I had left the party early. "You didn't even say goodbye to anyone," my mom texted, as if that was the worst thing I had done. I ignored the messages at first. I needed some space to think, but the calls kept coming, and eventually I picked up when my mom called again. I figured I'd just tell her the truth. "Why did you leave like that, Lucas?" "It was rude," she said as soon as I answered. I took a deep breath. "Mom, I left because I'm tired. I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter. I've been helping you guys for years, and all I hear is how I'm a disappointment. At the party, you and Dad were laughing about me. What's the point of helping if that's how you see me?" There was a long pause on her end. Then she sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Lucas, you're overreacting. You know how proud we are of Emily. She's doing something really impressive, and we just want to celebrate her achievements. It's not about you." "Exactly. It's never about me," I said, my voice shaking. "You didn't even mention me at the party. Not once. And when people asked about me, you brushed it off like my career doesn't matter. I'm done feeling like this. I'm done sending money. You can figure it out without me." Her tone changed immediately. "Lucas, don't be ridiculous. You can't just stop helping. We've done so much for you, raised you, supported you. This is what family does. We all chip in." I couldn't help but laugh at that. "Really? Because it doesn't feel like a team effort, Mom. It feels like I'm the only one chipping in while you and Dad sit back and praise Emily for being the perfect child." She started to argue, but I cut her off. "I'm serious, Mom. I'm done. Don't call me asking for money anymore." Then I hung up before she could say anything else. The calls didn't stop, of course. Over the next few days, my dad tried calling, but I didn't answer. Emily sent me a text saying, "You're really putting a strain on Mom and Dad right now. This is selfish, Lucas." That one hurt more than I expected. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide if I should reply. Eventually I did. "Selfish? Really? If anyone's selfish here, it's you." Her response came almost immediately. "I didn't ask you to pay my tuition. You chose to do that. Don't blame me for your decisions." That was the moment I realized just how far apart we drifted. After that, I blocked her. I knew it wasn't a permanent solution, but I couldn't deal with her attitude anymore. The first month after I stopped sending money was strange. I kept expecting my phone to ring with another guilt trip or angry message, but it was quiet, too quiet. Honestly, at first I felt guilty. I'd been supporting them for so long that it felt wrong to just stop, even though I knew I had every right to. My parents didn't give up easily. After a few weeks of silence, they started reaching out through other people. My aunt called me one night, clearly uncomfortable with the whole thing. "Lucas, I don't want to get in the middle of this, but your mom is really upset. She says you're refusing to help them. What's going on?" I sighed. "Aunt Judy, I'm just done. They've been taking advantage of me for years, and I can't do it anymore. I'm not their bank. If they're upset, that's on them." She didn't argue with me, which I appreciated. "I understand," she said after a moment. "But they're struggling, Lucas. You might want to think about helping them. Even just a little." I thanked her for the advice, but I didn't take it. I'd already made up my mind. The thing is, once you stop giving in to people who take you for granted, you start to see things more clearly. I started thinking about all the times I bent over backward for my family and how little they'd done in return. When I moved to the city, they didn't help me at all, not even a ride to the train station. When I got my first promotion, they didn't celebrate it. But when Emily got into law school, it was like the second coming of Christ. Looking back, I realized they'd never really seen me as a person with my own goals and dreams. To them, I was just the older brother, the one who had to make sacrifices so Emily could shine. It was a few months after I stopped sending money that Emily finally reached out again. Up until that point, I hadn't heard much from her after I blocked her. I assumed she'd just moved on, figuring out her own way to manage things. But apparently, things weren't going as smoothly as she'd hoped. I still remember the exact moment she called. It was a Wednesday evening, and I'd just gotten home from work. My phone buzzed, and her name popped up on the screen. For a second, I debated not answering. I mean, what could she possibly have to say that I'd want to hear? But out of curiosity, I picked up. Lucas, she said, her voice tight. No hello, no small talk, just my name, like she was gearing up for something big. What's up? I asked, already bracing myself. She sighed, and I could practically hear her trying to decide how to phrase whatever she was about to say. Look, I need your help. My tuition for the second year is due, and Mom and Dad said they can't pay it. I've tried to get scholarships, but there's nothing available right now, and I don't know what to do. There was the ask. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as I tried to process what she was saying. Emily, I already helped with your first year, I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. I told you I couldn't keep doing this. You knew that. Her tone shifted immediately. The desperation was still there, but now it had this sharp edge, like she was getting annoyed with me. Yeah, but I thought you'd understand how important this is, Lucas. If I don't pay, I could get kicked out. Do you have any idea what that would look like? Everyone knows I'm in law school. If I drop out, it'll be humiliating for me and for the family. I sat up straight, her words hitting me like a slap in the face. Emily, are you seriously more worried about how it'll look than the fact that you might actually get kicked out? That's what you care about. She didn't even hesitate. Of course I care about that. I've worked so hard to get here, and I can't let it all fall apart because you suddenly decided to be selfish. There was that word again, selfish. I'd heard it so many times from my parents and now from Emily. Every time, it stung a little less. But this time, it just made me angry. Selfish. I repeated, laughing bitterly. Emily, do you even hear yourself? Now, because I finally said no, I'm the selfish one. She let out this frustrated groan, like I was being unreasonable. Lucas, I'm not asking you to support me forever. Just this one time, okay? I'll pay you back once I'm a lawyer. You know I will. That was the part that really got to me. She didn't even realize what she was asking. To her, it was just this one time, but to me, it was years of being taken for granted. I knew in that moment that if I gave in now, it wouldn't be the last time. There would always be one more thing she needed help with, and I couldn't keep doing it. No, Emily, I said firmly. I'm done. You need to figure this out on your own. She was quiet for a second, and I thought maybe she was trying to process what I said. But then she spoke, and her voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. You know what, Lucas? Fine, be that way. But don't come crying to me when you need something. At least I'm trying to do something with my life. Unlike you. I didn't even respond. I just hung up. The next time I heard anything about Emily was through one of our relatives. Apparently, she'd been venting to everyone who would listen about how I refused to help her and how it was my fault that she was struggling. Mom and Dad backed her up, of course, painting me as the villain in this whole situation. Over the next few months, things started to unravel for Emily. Without my financial support, she had to take on part-time work, which ate into her study time. She started falling behind in her classes, and by the end of the semester, she failed a couple of them. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little bad for her. She was clearly in over her head, and it was obvious that Mom and Dad weren't stepping up to help her the way I had. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to care as much as I used to. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. Every so often, I'd hear updates through the grapevine about how she was doing. Some relatives tried to make me feel guilty, saying things like, if only you'd helped a little more, maybe things would have turned out differently. But I knew better. Emily's situation wasn't my fault. It was the result of years of entitlement and unrealistic expectations. By the time summer rolled around, I heard she had officially dropped out of law school. Apparently, the stress of trying to balance work and school had been too much, and she couldn't keep up. I didn't feel good about it, but I didn't feel bad either. It was just whatever. After Emily dropped out of law school, things started to spiral for my family. I wasn't directly involved anymore, but the updates came through various relatives and mutual acquaintances. I didn't go looking for the information. It just had a way of finding me. Small towns are like that. The first thing I heard was about Emily moving back in with my parents. She hadn't been able to make it on her own after losing her student status. Apparently, the part-time job she had wasn't enough to cover her rent, and without being enrolled in school, she couldn't qualify for the scholarship she'd been banking on. So back she went, tail between her legs, to the same house where she had been the star child just a few years ago. At first, I figured my parents would be happy to have her back. I mean, she was their golden child. But from what I heard, things weren't exactly smooth sailing. It turns out that Emily had grown used to living on her own and wasn't thrilled about being under their roof again. She clashed with them constantly, about money, about house rules, about everything. One of our old neighbors, Mrs. Bailey, ran into me at the grocery store when I was in town visiting a friend and filled me in on some of the details. She was the type who loved gossip and didn't seem to care whether it was her place to share. Lucas, I don't mean to pry, she started, which was a clear sign that she absolutely did. But I've been hearing some arguments coming from your parents' house. Everything all right over there. I shrugged, trying to seem indifferent. I wouldn't know, Mrs. Bailey. I haven't talked to them in a while. She gave me a look that said she didn't believe me, but kept going anyway. Well, it's just that Emily seems to be struggling a bit. I see her around town sometimes, and she doesn't look too happy. And your father? Well, let's just say he's not his usual cheerful self. The next big update came from my aunt who called me one evening. I hadn't spoken to her much since everything went down, but she was always the one in the family who tried to mediate conflicts. Lucas, she said, her voice heavy with concern, I just wanted to let you know that things are getting tough for your parents. I leaned back in my chair, already bracing for the guilt trip. What's going on? Well, she started drawing out the word, your dad lost his job a few weeks ago. There was some kind of incident at work. I don't know the full story, but he had to resign. And your mom, Bless her, she's been trying to pick up more hours at the grocery store, but it's not enough. I didn't say anything right away. Part of me felt bad for them. Losing a job is never easy, especially at their age. But another part of me couldn't help but think that maybe this was karma catching up with them. I just thought you should know, my aunt continued. They're really struggling to make ends meet. And with Emily back home, well, it's been hard on everyone. I took a deep breath before responding. I appreciate you letting me know, Aunt Judy, but there's nothing I can do. I've already done more than my fair share for them. She didn't argue after that, but the call left me feeling uneasy. I wasn't second-guessing my decision, but it was hard not to think about how things had gotten to this point. As the months went by, I started hearing more about how things were falling apart at home. My dad, once the breadwinner, was now struggling to find work. Apparently, his incident at work had been serious enough, a safety-related issue, that it was making it hard for him to get hired anywhere else. Meanwhile, my mom was burning herself out trying to pick up the slack, working as many shifts as she could. And then there was Emily. She wasn't working much from what I heard. She spent most of her time at home playing video games and scrolling through social media. She'd gone from being the golden child to a 20-something living in her parents' basement, and I could only imagine how that was affecting her ego. It wasn't long before the neighbors started noticing the tension. Mrs. Bailey wasn't the only one who'd heard the arguments. Apparently, they were loud enough to draw attention from half the street. One of my cousins told me that my dad and Emily got into it one night, screaming at each other so loudly that someone actually called the police. They didn't do anything, my cousin said when he told me about it. But it's pretty bad over there, Lucas. I don't blame you for keeping your distance. The final straw came when my dad tried reaching out to me directly. He called from an unfamiliar number, probably because I'd blocked him on his usual one. At first, I didn't recognize his voice. It was hoarse and tired, like he'd aged 10 years in just a few months. Lucas, he said, his tone softer than I expected. I know we've had our differences, but I need to talk to you. It's important. I didn't say anything right away, waiting to see where he was going with this. We're in a bit of a tight spot, he continued, and I was wondering if you could help us out, just until I get back on my feet. I closed my eyes, trying to keep my frustration in check. Dad, I've already told you. I'm done. I can't keep bailing you out. I'm not asking for much, he said quickly. Just enough to cover the bills for a couple of months. Please, Lucas, we're your family. That word again, family. It was always their go-to when they wanted something. I'm sorry, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He tried to argue, but I hung up before he could get too far. I knew if I let him keep talking, I'd start to feel guilty again, and I couldn't afford to go down that road. Now it's been almost a year since I cut ties with my family, and honestly, I feel like a completely different person. When I think back to where I was last Christmas, stressed, broke, and constantly worried about disappointing people who never seem to care about me, I can hardly believe how far I've come. It's not like everything is perfect now, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm in control. After I stopped sending money to my family, I suddenly had all this extra breathing room financially. It was strange at first. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for so long that I didn't even know what to do with the extra money. For the first few months, I saved as much as I could, just in case something unexpected came up. But as my savings grew, I realized I could finally start doing things for myself. Small things at first, a better chair for my desk, some new clothes, little upgrades to my apartment. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it felt good to finally invest in myself. Work has been a huge focus for me this past year, and I've made some big strides. Not long after everything went down with my family, I got a promotion at my company. I'm now leading a small team of developers, and we've been working on a project that could really put us on the map. It's exciting, but it's also a lot of pressure. The funny thing is, I'm handling the pressure better than I ever thought I could. I think cutting ties with my family freed up so much mental energy that I can now put into my work. I don't have that constant weight on my shoulders anymore. The guilt, the obligation, the stress of trying to please people who never appreciated me. For the first time, I feel like I'm actually good at what I do. I don't mean that in a braggy way. It's just that I've stopped doubting myself so much. Before, every time I achieved something, I'd hear my parents' voices in my head, downplaying it or comparing it to Emily's accomplishments. But now those voices are gone, and it feels incredible. One of the biggest changes in my life has been deciding to go back to school. This was something I never thought I'd get the chance to do. Growing up, college always felt like this unattainable dream. My parents made it clear they wouldn't help me with tuition, and for a long time, I just accepted that I'd never have the opportunity. But now, with my finances in a much better place, I've started taking online classes in business management. It's been a challenge balancing work and school, but it's a challenge I actually enjoy. I'm learning so much, and I'm already seeing how I can apply some of it to my job. Eventually, I'd love to start my own business. That's the long-term goal. I don't know exactly what it'll look like yet, maybe a software company or a consulting firm, but the idea of being my own boss is really motivating me. Socially, things have been different. Cutting ties with my family hasn't been easy to explain to people, especially new friends or coworkers. When someone asks about my family, I usually just give a vague answer like, we're not really in touch. Most people don't push further, but every now and then someone will ask, why not? It's hard to sum up years of dysfunction in a single sentence. Sometimes I just say, we had different priorities, and leave it at that. But the truth is, I don't really care what people think about it anymore. I used to feel ashamed, like I'd failed as a son or a brother. But now I realize that walking away was the best thing I could have done. As for my family, I haven't heard much from them recently. For a while, there were the occasional guilt trips through relatives, my aunt calling to say my mom was struggling, a cousin asking if I consider helping Emily out again. But eventually, those calls stopped. From what I've gathered, things haven't improved much for them. My dad still hasn't found steady work, and my mom is working even more hours to keep the house running. Emily, last I heard, was still living at home and not doing much of anything. It's sad in a way. I don't wish them harm, but I also don't feel responsible for their choices anymore. They made their bed, and now they have to lie in it. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that you don't owe anyone your peace. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away, even if it feels like the hardest choice in a moment. So yeah, that's where I am now. It's not perfect, and it's not easy, but it's mine. And honestly, that's all I've ever wanted.